All right, folks, we might continue on. What we're going to do now is to have a few minutes to take questions from the floor to each of our three speakers tonight. When we've concluded with the question time, we do have the opportunity to have a few what we call parish announcements for both the ACT gunner community, and also Head of Regiment Brigadier Craig Farini is going to present a few gifts to our speakers. So we'll move through that format. Can I just remind you, we are recording tonight, so it's very important for those people asking questions to just pause, make sure we've got the microphone to you, and we've got our two fantastic young advert gentlemen with us to pass you the mic and then address your question to the speaker, and off we'll go. So the floor is open. We invite you to consider some questions. General Stevens.
Thank you. I have a question for Colonel Gross. It seems that in 1917, both the British and the German Army were working towards better artillery cooperation with attacks, and manifesting itself through the advent of a rolling barrage and also the ability to open fire without previous registration, or with a minimal previous registration. Similarly, in the British Army at the time, techniques such as sound ranging and flash spotting were moving towards their culmination. Was this a process that was occurring in the German Army at the same time as well?
That's an interesting question, but it's easy to give an answer. It was the same. Because we ever forget, all the armies at the Western Front make the same learning process. Some a little bit quicker and some a little bit slower. And in the artillery, they were very, very near together.
Roger, moving away from the Western Front to Palestine, what are the sort of contrasting differences between the artillery use in Palestine in a mobile warfare context in 1917 as against the Western Front, where it's very much a static warfare context? And how important was artillery in that Palestine campaign?
Yeah, thanks, Don. That's quite a good question. The first thing I'd say, though, is you've got to get this myth out of your mind of the Palestine Front being light horsemen charging all over the desert with irregular Arabs in support and having a good time. There were actually 2 corps of British infantry there, most of it, and they took standard infantry formations with them, including divisional artillery. They took corps artillery. There was a lot of artillery, even tanks, in the Middle East. Artillery was very important, as you will have seen from one of the slides of mine that worked tonight. In Palestine, there were 4 battles in 1917 of any great import. The first 2 were a failure, the last 2 were a success. The success of the last 2, they were positional battles, just like something on the Western Front, with an artillery barrage, counter-battery fire. They were bringing all the artillery techniques of the Western Front to the war in the desert. The only limitations, of course, were because there were the infrastructure was pretty poor, roads were pretty poor, and there were very few railways except the one the Brits were building across the Sinai, and the one that the Turks had built that good old Lawrence keeps blowing up. That was very difficult to move heavy ordnance like railway guns. But yeah, there were plenty of 9.2 inch howitzers in the standard British Corps firing in support of both at Gaza and then later on. Does that answer your question?
Sie haben es schon bemerkt, Herr Groß. Ich möchte Ihnen fragen, ob in der Zeit, ob der Bundeswehr eine besondere Meinung von Australien hatten, also nicht aus Teil der britischen Armee, sondern insbesondere aus australische Truppen. And for everybody in the room, did the German army at that time have a considered opinion of the Australians, not as a part of the British army?
That's a good and great question, and it's an easy answer too. For example, at the Battle of the 8th of August, the Black Day of the German Army, the Australian divisions was the spearhead of the attack. And for the German Army, the Australian army, the Australian divisions, was first-class divisions. They have numbered out the divisions of the enemies, and the Australians, the New Zealanders, and the Canadians are the three first class. And at the beginning of the attack in the 8th of August 1918, 2 or 3 weeks before, they put some headquarters from the Australian divisions up to Flanders, and they gave signal units. And the Germans are thinking that the Australian divisions were placed at Flanders. And so they were totally astonished when the Australian divisions attacked on the 8th of August. Because they, at this time, they said when the Australian divisions or the New Zealanders was near the German front, every time they are thinking about attack.
Mine's a rather more technical question, but it goes to both sides. I've read accounts of trench warfare when infantry formations prided themselves on closing with their artillery fire, and that was described as being as close as 25 yards. I assume that that must have been from shrapnel shell, not from HE, but my curiosity is, given that the artillery started the war with things like the 18 QF, and that used a lot of shrapnel shell. During the war, it seems that shrapnel shell was less used. Was shrapnel used with the lighter guns on both sides? And was it phased out in a similar way on both sides? And ultimately, why was that? Because of cost or because of relative effectiveness? Use of shrapnel versus HE.
It's actually a bit more complicated than that. It's got to do with the nature of the barrage itself. By 1917, the British have and the Germans have as well, devised a very structured barrage designed for whatever the purpose is that you want to do. And they can fire either shrapnel or HE, depending on what their role and function is. If you're attacking, the purpose for the light guns is just to keep the enemy in their fortifications. So for that, shrapnel is actually quite effective, and in some ways better than the small explosive charge in an 18-pounder. So yeah, they would fire shrapnel if they were firing the barrage just in front, the creeping barrage just in front of the advancing infantry. But in the meantime, some of the field guns, but more importantly the medium and heavy guns, are firing in depth beyond it and doing different tasks, and they're tending to fire more HE because they're trying to do destruction of certain positions rather than suppression. But they're also mixing gas into this. So some of the guns are firing gas shells further into the rear zone to counter battery or suppress enemy artillery. There's HE mixed in the rolling barrage as well to try and knock out those small defensive strong points. The Germans based their defence from 1917 around scattered, as the Colonel said, around scattered outposts of machine gunners in mutually interlocking positions. Quite often in shell holes, sometimes in specifically built concrete pillboxes, but more often scattered around. Shrapnel's good for taking those out, but if they're in a sheltered strong point, you need to engage it. You can't engage it with a 6-inch or a 9.2-inch howitzer if you've got infantry 50 metres behind. So you use some small explosive charges as well. So it all sounds a bit confused, but it depends on what you're talking about, the purpose of the barrage is, and what the plan is. Sometimes, for instance, the barrages would go forward, or they would fall on what they thought was the enemy's forward defensive zone, progress forward into their defence zone, then come back again. And as they do that, the nature of the ammunition they fire would change. They'd use HE in the first barrage, then substitute shrapnel as it comes back, because the purpose then is to suppress rather than destroy.
This answer is quite perfect. I've never said anything. The only thing I can say is this picture here shows perfect the problem of the artillery in the First World War, especially the German artillery problems. The own artillery devastated the ground they need to put up to the attack. And the Germans had no cars. And they have every time these problems. And so they were not able to, the artillery wasn't able to follow the infantry so mobile that it's possible and so fast. And so they every time has to stop and to waiting for the artillery. And that's the problem of the year 1918. The artillery wasn't able to go so fast with the infantrymen, and so the infantrymen at every time stopped attacking. and have waiting. And this was the time the British or the French troops can transport it by railway directly in the front of the German offensive. And the British have thinking about this, and the tank is a consequence of this problem.
I have a question for Roger. In relation, we're talking about gun tube artillery all the time. Where does both sides, small mortars and German mine workers of various calibers, where do they fit into these planned barrage applications for the conflict at that stage? Because both sides have got a plebiscite of multiple small mortars and even large mortars. So everything I read doesn't really mention, you see them in all the museums, you don't really see their position in the defensive and offensive structures of both armies.
You've basically got three classes of mortars: light, medium and heavy. The light trench mortars are part of the infantry and go forward with an attacking force or are deployed forward in a defensive role. Mortars, of course, have limited range, good trajectory but limited range. They're also a new weapon. I was just reading the other night when I was reading a war diary of a trench mortar company that the early British mortars in particular had a rather alarming tendency for the round to go off as a result of the jar of the propulsion going off, which was very good for career prospects but not very good for morale. The heavy and medium trench mortars suffered from the same problem as large artillery pieces in that they were very difficult to move. So both sides tended to treat them as like underpowered howitzers. So the heavy and medium trench mortars would fire more HE into the intermediate depth in the attacking zone when they were supporting an attack. The light trench mortars tended not to fire in an attack. They were used once you secured your objective. They were then used in a forward position to try and break up enemy counter-attacks. I mean, the Germans by 1917 have got, as the Colonel said, have got a very effective defensive system. It's based on a very deep defensive zone, and the defence is done by counter-attack troops, both the local garrison divisions, and then behind there, in good shelter, there are specially trained, well-equipped and fresh counter-attack divisions. And once the Germans work out where the main point of the Allied attack is, they launch these on them after the attacking divisions have gone through this killing zone of the forward and the intermediate defensive zone. And this works quite well. This is what basically destroys the Nivelle offensive. The French break through and get slaughtered in this killing zone. Then these counter-attack divisions drive them right back, which is a long involved story to say the French didn't at that stage take as many things like rifle grenades, trench mortars and even light artillery forward with them. The defence for the French on securing the captured ground was based very much on their infantry. The British took a different view. They tended to move Vickers machine guns forward as quickly as possible. They tended to move light trench mortars forward as quickly as possible. And every major attack is accompanied by pioneers or field engineers to build strong points and defensive positions because they've seen this German defensive technique in work. And light trench mortars are integral to that because of their mobility, their trajectory and their explosive power.
Peter Mark, I just wanted to get an idea from the difference in tactics that were employed on the Western Front versus the Eastern Front. So given the size of the fronts was so significantly different, I guess from a German perspective, was there a difference in the tactics that were adopted or the support of artillery on the two different fronts?
There is a difference because the Russian has no heavy artillery. The German holds the Eastern Front with his 15 centimeters artillery for the complete war. And the big attack on Gorlice-Tano 1915 was only so fast and so strong from the Germans because the Germans put their 15 centimeter artillery howitzers and they were able to destroy the Russian trenches after minutes. And in the whole war, the Russian wasn't able to build up a heavy artillery. And so the Germans were able to make this area to a tasting area. They tasted the artillery, Bruchmüller tasted the artillery, new artillery components in Riga. They tasted the attacking in Riga. And the British are very interested to learn, to hear from the Russians what did the Germans making on the Eastern Front, because they knew after a several time they tested on the Eastern Front and bring it back to the Western Front. And the same problem had the great breakthrough in Italy. Italy was the first testing for 1918 by Caporetto. That's the first testing. And so the Germans were able to hold with a small hands of divisions the Eastern Front. They have every time problems when her allies, Austria-Hungary, had problems, and they had often problems on the Eastern Front. And in this situation, the Germans put divisions from the West Front to the East Front, and then they had problems on the West Front.
All I'd add to that is you've got to bear in mind the scale. On the Western Front, there's no flank. You've got the North Sea or the Swiss mountains. On the Eastern Front, there is no continuous line of fronts. On the Western Front, you've got well-developed infrastructure, road, rail, canals, all that kind of stuff. On the Eastern Front, you've got forests, the Pripyat marshes, vast areas of little development. Manoeuvre is very hard on the Eastern Front, but the borders, the trench lines aren't continuous. So if you've got a capable enemy, like the Germans against the Russians, the Germans lead the Russians on a merry dance all the time. Particularly as well, the Germans were reading, the Russians didn't understand about code in communications. They transmit on wireless in clear, including before the Battle of Masurian Lakes. A Russian staff officer actually announces most of the key points of the plan, and the Germans listen to it, but his own colleagues can't receive it. So there's a few major issues like that. But the fundamental difference between tactics is on the Eastern Front, you've got huge scale with limited opportunity to apply technology and new capabilities to it. On the Western Front, the only way you're going to get anywhere is by bringing new technology, new capabilities like bigger guns, better communications equipment, tanks, better aircraft to the front. So in a sense, the tactics rather reflect like always, the geography of the terrain.
Well, it looks as though we've completed all our questions. Thank you for all those contributions and for engaging our speakers with some very good questions.